I want to tell you about the evening my father stood in front of 300 people at his company's anniversary gala and introduced me as the family disappointment, and about what happened 40 minutes later when two black SUVs pulled up to the venue and a man in a dark suit walked through the door looking for me. But I need to start earlier, much earlier, because the moment only lands with its full weight if you understand the years that preceded it. My father, Robert Reeves, built a defense contracting company over 30 years. Not a massive company, about 200 employees at its peak, specializing in logistics support systems for military installations. He had done well, he was proud of what he had built, and he had reason to be. He was also in the way of certain successful men, convinced that the framework through which he had achieved his success was the correct framework for evaluating everyone else's. His framework had a specific problem when it came to me. I joined the Navy at 22 with a degree in computer science from Virginia Tech. I went in as an officer, was selected for a cryptological intelligence track that my father could not have had clearance to know the details of, and spent the following 14 years building a career in signals intelligence and cybersecurity that I cannot describe in anything approaching complete detail without violating multiple agreements I have signed. What I can say is that by the time of my father's gala, I held the rank of commander. I led a team whose work touched national security infrastructure at a level that would have surprised most people who passed me on the street. I had been deployed 4 times. I had been mentioned in a classified commendation that I am not able to reference publicly. I had at 35 been selected for a program that would determine whether I would become one of the Navy's senior intelligence officers in the coming decade. My father knew none of the specifics. Not because I was hiding things from him beyond what classification required, but because we had never had the kind of relationship in which I explained my career and he listened. We had the kind of relationship in which he expressed his ongoing assessment of my career, and I absorbed it, and I had stopped trying to correct the assessment years before the gala. His assessment: I had joined the military instead of doing something with my computer science degree. I had spent 14 years in a bureaucratic institution that stifled innovation. I had passed up multiple opportunities he had tried to create for me through contacts at his company and elsewhere to enter the private sector and build something real. I was intelligent and capable, and I was wasting both. He said these things with genuine concern. That was what made them land the way they did. He was not trying to wound me. He was trying to express a sincere, considered belief that I had chosen wrong, and that his love for me included the obligation to keep saying so. I had heard variations of this assessment at every family event for 14 years. The gala was for his company's 30th anniversary. 300 guests, clients, contractors, partners, a handful of government officials who worked in the defense procurement space, people who had been part of his business ecosystem for years. It was held at a hotel ballroom in Arlington, Virginia. There was a dinner and speeches and a slide presentation about the company's history and what he called the Reeves family legacy of service to the defense of this nation. I want to pause on that phrase because it is relevant to what came later. The Reeves family legacy of service to the defense of this nation. He said it in his speech with genuine pride. He talked about his 30 years of building a company that supported military operations. He talked about his grandfather's service in World War II. He talked about the values of dedication and sacrifice and commitment to something larger than yourself. Then he got to the part about his family. He talked about my mother, who had supported him through every difficult year. He talked about my brother Marcus, who had joined the company 5 years earlier and was being groomed to lead it into its next chapter. He talked about his nephew, who had just started law school. He talked about me last. He said, and my daughter Diana, who has been serving her country in the Navy for 14 years. Diana has always been the one who did things her own way. He paused. He said, we're still waiting to see how that turns out. He smiled. The kind of smile that tells the room it's a joke, that signals everyone to laugh, that positions what he's just said as affectionate rather than dismissive. 300 people laughed. I was sitting at a table near the back of the room. I had been placed there. I understood later that this was not an accident rather than near the front with family, because Marcus's wife's parents needed seats near the front and there wasn't quite enough room. I sat at my table near the back of the room and I heard 300 people laugh at a joke that was not entirely a joke, and I looked at my water glass and I thought about 14 years of work that I could not put in a room and say, this is what I have been doing. This is what I am. I did not cry. I had stopped being someone who cried at my father's assessments of me approximately 7 years earlier. I put my water glass down. I ate my dinner. I listened to the rest of the speeches, which were about Marcus and the company and the future and the Reeves family legacy. And then, 40 minutes after my father's speech, the ballroom doors opened and 2 men in dark suits walked in. I noticed them because they moved differently than the waitstaff and differently than the guests. They moved with the particular efficiency of people who have entered a room to accomplish something specific and are not interested in the ambient social experience of the event around them. One of them spoke briefly to a hotel staff member near the door. The staff member pointed. They walked toward my table. The taller one reached the table first. He was perhaps 40, with close-cropped hair and an expression that was professional and serious without being unkind. He looked at me and said, quietly enough that only the people immediately around me could hear, "Commander Reeves." I said, "Yes." He said, "Ma'am, I apologize for the interruption. There's a situation that requires your immediate attention. We have vehicles outside." The table around me had gone very still. I said, "Understood." I folded my napkin. I placed it beside my plate. I pushed back my chair and stood up. The man said, "I'm sorry to pull you from the event, Commander. We'll get you back as soon as we can." I said, "It's all right, let's go." I want to describe what happened in the room as we walked toward the exit because it is the part of the evening that I have thought about most in the years since. The room noticed. Not all at once and not loudly, the event was still in progress. The band was playing softly. Most of the 300 guests were in their own conversations. But the table immediately around mine had fallen silent, and a ripple of awareness moved outward from that point, the way ripples move when something disrupts a surface. My father was at the head table at the front of the room. I do not know exactly when he noticed. I was not looking at him as we walked. But I know from what my mother told me later that he saw us cross the room, saw two men in dark suits escorting his daughter toward the exit with a purpose that was unmistakable, and that he was quiet for a long time after that. The situation that had required my immediate attention was classified, and I am not going to describe it here beyond saying that it was resolved, that it required approximately 4 hours of work that night, and that I was back in my apartment. I did not return to the gala. My mother called me the following morning. She said, "Your father wants to talk to you." I said, "I know." She said, "Diana, the room. After those men walked you out. I don't know if you could see it from where you were," but she paused. She said, "People were asking questions for the rest of the evening, who those men were, what you do. Your father spent the last hour of his own anniversary gala explaining that he didn't actually know what you do." I said, "I know he doesn't." She said, "I think he's starting to understand that's a problem." My father called me that afternoon. He sounded different from how he usually sounded when we talked. Not humble exactly. My father was not a man who arrived at humility easily or completely, but unsettled. The particular unsettlement of someone who has had the ground shift under an assumption they had never thought to examine. He said, "Can you tell me what that was about last night?" He said, "The men, what they wanted." I said, "It's classified, Dad." He said, "Diana," I said, "I understand you want an explanation. I can't give you one. This is what my work looks like sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Those men knew who you were. They came specifically for you." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you actually do?" I said, "I can't tell you everything. I can tell you that I lead a team that works on problems that matter at a level that would surprise you. I can tell you that what happened last night was not unusual for my position. I can tell you that the reason I have never been able to fully explain my career to you is not because I was embarrassed by it or because there was nothing to explain, but because most of it is classified and I have legal obligations I can't set aside." He was quiet for a longer time. He said, "I made a joke about you last night, in front of 300 people." I said, "I know." He said, "I said we were still waiting to see how it turns out." I said, "I heard you." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't. You never asked." That sentence landed differently than I expected it to. I had said versions of it before in conversations with my mother in the privacy of my own thoughts, but I had never said it directly to my father in those specific words. "You never asked." He was quiet. He said, "You're right, I never asked." I said, "You built a career in defense contracting. You know what the classification system means. You know there are things people in my position can't discuss even with family. You could have assumed at any point in 14 years that the fact that I couldn't tell you everything didn't mean there was nothing to tell." He said, "I assumed the opposite." I said, "I know." He said, "That was arrogant of me." It was the most self-aware thing I had ever heard my father say. I sat with it for a moment before responding. I said, "Yes, it was." He said, "I'm sorry about the speech." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm sorry about more than the speech." I said, "I know." The conversation that followed lasted another hour and was the most honest exchange my father and I had ever had about my career, my choices, and the space between what he had believed for 14 years and what was actually true. He asked questions. Real ones, not rhetorical ones. Not questions designed to set up a point he wanted to make, but questions born of genuine unfamiliarity with a world he had been adjacent to for 30 years without understanding it. I answered what I could answer, some things I couldn't answer. He asked questions that ran directly into classification walls, and I told him so plainly, and he accepted it in a way that surprised me, not with frustration, but with something that looked like the beginning of respect for a framework he had previously dismissed. He said, "I've been in defense contracting for 30 years and I never thought about what it must be like to do the actual work." I said, "Most contractors don't." He said, "Is that an indictment?" I said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound, not the performative laugh from the gala, but the real one, the one I heard sometimes when he was caught off guard by something that was actually funny. He said, "Fair enough. What happened in the months after the gala I want to describe carefully because I think the aftermath matters as much as the event. My father did not transform overnight. He was 62 years old and had been certain about certain things for a very long time, and certainty of that duration does not dissolve in a single phone call, however significant. He was still the man who had made the joke. He was still the man who had placed me at a table near the back because there wasn't quite enough room at the front. He was still the man who had spent 14 years watching me choose, something he didn't value, and responding with the particular persistence of someone who believed he was right and that eventually the evidence would prove it. But something had shifted. He started asking questions when we talked. Not every call, sometimes he reverted to the established pattern, talking about the company and Marcus and the things he could track and evaluate within his existing framework. But more often than before, he would say, "What are you working on? What can you tell me? Is there anything I'm allowed to know?" The answer was usually limited, but the asking mattered. My brother Marcus called me about 3 weeks after the gala. Marcus and I had always been cordial in the particular way of siblings who have grown up in the same household, with the same complicated parent, and who have navigated that complexity in completely different ways. He by becoming the version of himself our father could understand and reward. Me by becoming the version of myself that I needed to be, regardless of whether it mapped on anyone else's framework. He said, "I need to tell you something about the night of the gala." He said, "After those men walked you out, Dad didn't speak for about 10 minutes, just sat there. Mom was talking to people around him and he was just quiet." I said, "What was he thinking?" Marcus said, "I don't know exactly, but I heard him say something to Mom. I was close enough to catch it." I said, "What did he say?" Marcus said, "He said, I don't know what she does." He paused. He said, "The way he said it wasn't like before. Before it was always kind of dismissive, like what she does isn't important enough to know. This time it sounded different, like he was realizing that not knowing was a failure of attention rather than evidence that there was nothing to know." I sat with that. I said, "Do you think he actually understands it now?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think he's starting to. I think those 2 men in the suits did something that 14 years of you telling him couldn't do." He said, "I think he saw you in a context he couldn't dismiss." That was the most perceptive thing my brother had ever said to me about our family, and I told him so. He said, "I've been watching this for 14 years, Diana. I've had a front row seat. I just didn't say anything because I didn't know how." I said, "You could have said something earlier." He said, "I know, I'm sorry I didn't." I said, "I know you are." We talked for another hour, the first real conversation. About our father, about the company, about the different paths we had taken from the same starting point, and what those paths had looked like from each other's side. It was imperfect and incomplete in the way that conversations between siblings who have been running parallel rather than together always are, but it was real. He said near the end of the call, "You know what I kept thinking about after those men left?" I said, "What?" He said, "Dad said the Reeves family legacy is service to the defense of this nation. And then those men walked in and proved that the one person in the room who was actually doing that, actively, directly, in ways none of us can know about, was the one he'd made the joke about." I said, "The irony was not lost on me." He said, "I don't think it was lost on him either. That may be the truest thing about the whole evening. I have been back to my father's house several times. We have had dinners that were different from dinners before, not radically, not in ways that would be visible to someone who hadn't been watching for 14 years, but different in the specific texture of how he treats the fact of my career. He does not ask me to explain what I do in ways that assume it is unexplainable. He does not pivot quickly to Marcus and the company when my work comes up. He asks what he can ask, and he accepts the limits of what I can tell him, and the acceptance has a quality to it now that is different from before. He has not made another joke about waiting to see how it turns out. I do not think he will. The 2 men in the dark suits did not know they were doing anything other than their job that night. They came to find me because there was a situation that required my attention, and they found me and we left. And that was the full scope of their involvement in a moment that turned out to matter enormously for reasons that had nothing to do with the situation they had come about. I have thought about timing many times since that evening. About the 40 minutes between my father's speech and the door opening. About the specific combination of events that produced a moment in which 300 people watched 2 federal agents escort a woman my father had just described as the family in joke out of his anniversary gala, with a purpose that said wordlessly and unmistakably that she was something he had not understood. I did not arrange that timing. I could not have arranged that timing. It simply happened, the way things happen when a life has been built steadily and without anyone's particular notice, and then the life intersects with a moment that makes the steadiness suddenly visible. I am 36 years old. I am a commander in the United States Navy. I lead a team whose work I cannot describe, but that matters in ways I am certain of. I have a father who is learning at 62 to look at a life he spent 14 years misreading. I have a brother who is becoming, slowly and imperfectly, someone who says what he sees. And I have a memory of walking across a ballroom floor with 2 men in dark suits while 300 people went quiet around me, not because I had done anything dramatic or arranged anything or said a single word, but simply because the work I had been doing, quietly and without acknowledgement, had finally arrived in the room in a form that could not be explained away. It has always been enough. I just hadn't known until that evening how long I had been waiting for it to be visible. There is something I want to add that I left out of the main telling because I wasn't sure how to include it without it seeming like it was the point of the story, when in fact it is only one part of the point. About 6 weeks after the gala, my father came to Washington. Not to see me specifically, he had meetings with clients in the area, the kind of routine business travel that had brought him to Washington dozens of times over 30 years. But he called me the night before he arrived and asked if I wanted to have dinner. I said yes. We met at a restaurant in Georgetown. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at the table with his jacket on and his phone face down, which was unusual for him. He was typically scrolling through emails until the conversation required his attention. The fact that his phone was face down told me something before he said a word. He stood when I came to the table. He had always been someone who stood when a woman arrived at table, an old-fashioned courtesy he maintained regardless of the relationship. But this time it felt different, less automatic, more deliberate. We ordered. We made the preliminary conversation that dinners with my father always required. How was work? How was Marcus? How was Mom? What was the traffic like coming from wherever he'd been? And then he put down his fork and said, I want to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. I said, okay. He said, how long have you been doing work at the level those men came to get you for? I thought about how to answer honestly within the limits of what I could say. I said, a long time. He said, years. I said, years. He said, while I was making the joke. I said, yes. He was quiet. He said, I owe you more than an apology for the speech. I owe you an apology for 14 years of assuming I understood something I didn't bother to actually look at. I said, I know. He said, that's not enough to say I know that. I'm saying it anyway because I don't have. I told him that starting was the part that mattered. He said, your grandfather served in Korea. He never talked about it much. I used to think it was because there wasn't much to say. As I got older, I understood it was because most of it couldn't be said or shouldn't be said or was his to keep. I said, yes. He said, I think I've been doing the same thing to you in reverse, filling in the silence with my own version of what it meant instead of sitting with the fact that I didn't know. That was, I think, the most precise thing my father had ever said about the dynamic between us. Not an excuse, not an explanation, just a clear-eyed description of the specific error he had made for a very long time. I told him I appreciated it. He said, Diana, what happened that night at the gala, I know you didn't arrange it. I know those men came because of actual work, not because of anything related to me or that evening. But I want you to know that watching you walk out of that room changed something. I said, what did it change? He said, it changed the question. Before that night, the question in my head was always some version of when is she going to do something real. After that night, the question became, what has she been doing all this time that I don't know about? I said, those are very different questions. He said, I know. I should have been asking the second one for 14 years. We stayed at that restaurant until it was nearly closing. We talked about things we had never talked about, his own choices, the ones he had made at my age, what he had been certain about then that he now understood differently. He talked about his grandfather and what it had meant to grow up with a veteran who carried his service quietly rather than loudly, and how that had shaped what he understood about sacrifice and what he had failed to understand about mine. He said, I think I needed the service to be visible to recognize it. Medals, ceremonies, people in uniform standing at attention. The visible markers, and your work doesn't have those, or if it does, I'm not cleared to see them. I said, most of it you're not. He said, so I filled in the blank with what I already believed. I said, yes. He said, that was a failure of imagination as much as anything. I told him it was a generous way to frame it. He said, I'm trying to be honest without being so hard on myself that the honesty becomes about me instead of you. That was exactly right. I told him so. He looked slightly surprised that I had said it. Then he nodded. We paid the bill and walked out onto the street together. It was a cool evening in October, the kind that makes Georgetown feel like a place in a movie rather than a real city where real work happens. He stopped on the sidewalk before we sat. He said, can I ask you one more thing? I said, yes. He said, are you proud of what you do? I looked at him for a moment. I said, yes, genuinely and completely. He said, good. I should have asked that a long time ago too. I said, yes. He said, I'm asking now. I said, I know, Dad, I know. He hugged me on the sidewalk in Georgetown, which he had not done since I was approximately 12 years old. It was brief and slightly awkward in the way of men who are not practiced at physical affection and are trying to be different from who they have always been. It was real. I walked back to my hotel thinking about the question he had asked. Are you proud of what you do? Yes, genuinely and completely. I have been proud of it for 14 years while my father was waiting to see how it turned out. The pride was never contingent on his understanding it, and it will not become contingent on his understanding it now. But there is something about being asked, really asked, by the person whose approval you stopped needing years ago but whose recognition still lands differently than anyone else's that I didn't expect to feel the way I felt it. It mattered, not because I needed it to matter, because it did. I am 36 years old. I am a commander in the United States Navy doing work I cannot fully describe and that I am proud of every day. I have a father who stood on a sidewalk in Georgetown in October and asked if I was proud of what I do. And I have the memory of 2 black subs pulling up to a hotel in Arlington, Virginia, while 300 people watched a woman my father had just introduced as the family in joke walk out the door with the particular purposefulness of someone. That was enough, more than enough, it always was.